The sky above northern Germany was a killing field of contrails and fire. At 20,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Inside the vibrating belly of a B-17 flying fortress, Sergeant Robert Lewis wiped frost from his gun sight. His breath crystallized instantly. The intercom crackled. "Bandits! 6 o'clock low!" He swung the twin 50s toward the blur rising beneath the bomber formation. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 darted upward, sunlight flashing off its wings. Instinct screamed, "Aim straight at him." But Lewis hesitated, remembering the instructor's strange rule from Wendover Field. "Don't aim at the plane. Aim behind it. Always behind." His hands adjusted half a degree. He squeezed the trigger. The barrels roared. The tracers didn't hit the fighter. They curved through empty sky. Then, in a split second, the Bf-109 flew into the stream of bullets. Pieces of metal spiraled away as the German fighter erupted into black smoke. Lewis blinked in disbelief. The counterintuitive lesson had just saved his crew. Above the frozen clouds, one truth had been proven again. In aerial combat, survival belonged to those who learned to unlearn instinct. By 1943, the daylight bombing campaign over Europe had become a brutal test of physics, courage, and endurance. The 8th Air Force sent hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into Nazi-held territory. Their mission: cripple Germany's factories, oil refineries, and rail lines. But every mile they flew brought them into the reach of Luftwaffe interceptors. Agile, fast, and deadly. For the gunners aboard American bombers, the sky was both a workplace and a death trap. In the chaos of aerial battle, fractions of a second meant the difference between shooting down a fighter or being vaporized by a 20mm cannon burst. Yet most young Americans who climbed into the gun turrets had never even seen an airplane up close before training. Many were farm boys or factory hands, suddenly handed machine guns and told to defend their crews against some of the most skilled fighter pilots in the world. At first, their instincts betrayed them. When a German fighter appeared head-on or from the side, most gunners did what seemed natural. They aimed directly at the target. But bullets, like the planes themselves, obeyed the laws of motion. By the time a .50 caliber round reached the distance of a few hundred yards, the enemy aircraft had already moved somewhere else. The result? Near misses, wasted ammunition, and fatal seconds lost. U.S. Army Air Forces analysts noticed a disturbing trend in early missions. Despite expending millions of rounds, bomber formations were bringing down far fewer German fighters than expected. After-action reports from 1942 and early 1943 showed that bomber gunners averaged nearly 12,000 rounds for each confirmed kill. An unsustainable ratio given the weight of ammunition carried and the need for precision defense. Something fundamental was wrong with how men aimed their guns. The problem wasn't bravery, it was perception. In a dogfight or an attack run, both aircraft were moving, sometimes at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. The human brain simply wasn't wired to judge that kind of motion accurately. A gunner's eyes saw where the enemy was, not where it would be. So, in the time it took to react, line up, and fire, the target had already slipped ahead. To overcome this, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched an unprecedented scientific training revolution. They turned to physicists, psychologists, and engineers to teach soldiers not how to aim, but how to predict. The gunnery schools in Texas, Florida, and Utah became laboratories of human adaptation. Recruits spent hours studying scale models of aircraft, learning angular speed, bullet time of flight, and deflection shooting. The art of firing not at the target, but into the space where it would arrive. At places like Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona and Harlingen in Texas, instructors shouted a mantra that defied human instinct. Aim behind the plane, always behind. To most rookies, it sounded absurd. Yet, when tested on mechanical simulators, the results were clear. Those who trusted the mathematics of motion consistently outshot those who trusted their eyes. The physics were simple, but unforgiving. At 300 yards, a .50 caliber bullet took roughly a third of a second to reach its target. In that instant, a fighter closing at 400 miles per hour traveled over 200 feet. To hit it, a gunner had to fire not where it was, but where it would be in 1/3 of a second, effectively aiming into empty sky. What looked like behind was actually ahead in time. Still, knowing the theory was one thing. Believing it under fire was another. When the scream of engines and tracer fire filled the air, logic evaporated. Only relentless repetition could make the counterintuitive feel natural. That's why American gunnery schools became factories of discipline, where soldiers learned to trust physics more than panic. Every detail was drilled to muscle memory, tracking angles, estimating range, and leading targets by instinctive calculation. By 1944, the results of this quiet scientific revolution began to appear in combat reports. Bomber crews were surviving longer. Fighter interceptions that once decimated formations were now leaving burning wrecks in their wake. Yet, to understand how this transformation happened, and how America's gunners came to shoot down twice as many planes by aiming the wrong way, we must first examine the battlefield. Laboratories that made it possible. In 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces faced a challenge no classroom had ever solved before: teaching ordinary men to master aerial marksmanship in a world ruled by relative motion. Traditional rifle training meant standing still, aiming at a stationary target. But in the sky, nothing stood still. Not the shooter, not the target, not even the air itself. So the Air Forces built a new kind of school. At places like Tyndall Field in Florida and Las Vegas Army Gunnery School, they combined mathematics, film projection, and psychology into something revolutionary. Recruits walked into massive hangars filled with rotating mounts, moving targets, and synchronized film reels that simulated German fighters sweeping across the sky. These were called camera gunnery trainers, and they changed everything. Instead of firing live ammunition, trainees fired cameras. Each shot recorded a frame of film showing whether their aim had hit or missed the projected fighter. Instructors could then replay the footage, pointing out exactly where the student had aimed, how far they had led the target, and whether their timing matched the bullet's travel time. It was the birth of scientific gunnery. Every gunner learned to think like a physicist, to anticipate angles, closing speeds, and deflection. The classroom lessons drilled in mathematical precision. For example, if an enemy Mi-109 was approaching at 400 miles per hour and crossing 300 yards out, the gunner had to lead the aim by about 6 aircraft lengths. That meant aiming at a spot seemingly behind the enemy's tail. Counterintuitive, yes, but mathematically perfect. To reinforce these calculations, instructors used an ingenious device called the M2 trainer. Mounted on a rotating base, it projected attacking aircraft onto a panoramic screen, while the trainee moved his gun mount to track them. The system calculated lead, speed, and aim point in real time. It was clunky, mechanical, but, in essence, it was an analog flight simulator. By the end of 1943, this training had become standardized across all U.S. gunnery schools. The Air Force even recruited Hollywood to help. Directors like Howard Hawks and technical experts from studios produced educational films explaining deflection shooting with animation, graphs, and dramatic recreations. In one such film, Flexible Gunnery Deflection Shooting, a narrator calmly explained how a fighter pilot's future position was the only place worth shooting at. The audience, often terrified young men preparing for combat, learned that science, not courage, determined survival. Behind the statistics, though, lay something deeper, a cultural shift. American war training had always celebrated guts and instinct, but this new doctrine demanded restraint and trust in invisible principles. It asked men to deny their senses, to aim away from what they saw. This went against every instinct of self-preservation. Only repetition, confidence in the system, and absolute faith in the method could overcome that human resistance. And when those men graduated, they carried this invisible science into the frozen skies over Europe and the Pacific. In the ball turrets, waist positions, and top turrets of the B-17s and B-24s, the theory was tested under fire. German fighters often approached from oblique angles, head-on or from the rear quarter, making them even harder to track. The deflection method demanded composure. The slightest overcorrection could waste a burst or expose the bomber to a deadly attack. Reports from early 1944 began to show remarkable improvements. Bomber groups returning from missions over Germany reported kill ratios doubling compared to the previous year. Crews of the 303rd, 100th, and 91st bomb groups noted that veteran gunners, men who had internalized the aim-behind principle, were consistently bringing down enemy aircraft with far fewer rounds. The old ratio of 12,000 rounds per kill dropped dramatically, in some squadrons to fewer than 5,000. This wasn't just luck. It was the triumph of discipline over instinct. America had transformed the act of shooting into a form of applied physics. A bullet was no longer just lead and powder. It was a calculation. Distance, velocity, and time converging in midair. And as this doctrine spread, the difference became visible even to the enemy. Luftwaffe pilots began to remark that American bombers, once easy prey, were suddenly bristling with invisible precision. Many German reports described attacks ending abruptly as fighters were torn apart by what looked like blind bursts of fire, only to realize too late that those bursts had been perfectly placed behind their flight path. By late 1944, the idea of aiming wrong to hit right was no longer a curiosity. It was doctrine, tested, proven, and adopted across every major air theater. Yet, understanding why this strange technique worked so devastatingly well requires exploring not just the physics, but the people behind the guns, their fears, instincts, and the machinery that magnified them. Every man who stepped into a B-17's gun position faced a silent war before the shooting even began. It was the war between fear and focus. A gunner's first instinct, when he saw a German fighter slicing through the clouds toward him, was to aim dead on, to shoot where the enemy was. His pulse quickened, his breath shortened, and the primal reflex to act immediately, directly, took control. But instinct in aerial gunnery was the enemy. Those who aimed by reflex usually missed. Those who paused, who trusted their training and fired wrong, lived. Veterans recalled how difficult it was to make that leap of faith. One gunner from the 306th Bomb Group said, "It felt like suicide, aiming behind him. Everything in your gut says to fire at the plane." But the instructors were right. You had to shoot into where the plane would be, not where it was. The transformation wasn't about marksmanship. It was psychological. Recruits had to unlearn the most basic survival instinct. Act fast, aim true, follow your eyes. The gunnery schools broke this instinct through relentless drills. Days of aiming at silhouettes on film, mechanical trainers, and moving targets until the brain accepted what the senses denied. By the time they reached combat, their reactions were no longer emotional. They were mathematical. In the frozen skies, this mental rewiring became the difference between chaos and control. Under fire, where oxygen masks fogged and tracer lines blurred into orange streaks, these men operated on reflexes built from thousands of repetitions. To them, the act of aiming behind the target was no longer strange. It was survival encoded into muscle memory. But human training alone could not solve the limits of human reflex. The next breakthrough came from the gun sight itself. Early in the war, Gunners used the simple iron ring and bead sights, primitive and entirely dependent on human judgment. Estimating lead and distance under combat stress was nearly impossible. The error margin was deadly. Then came one of the most important tools of American air warfare, the Norden optical computing sight for bombers, and later the K3 and K14 computing gun sights for gunners and fighter pilots. These mechanical marvels translated mathematics into survival. The K14 sight, in particular, was revolutionary. It used a gyroscope to sense the gun's movement and automatically adjusted the reticle to project a lead point ahead of the target's path. Instead of guessing, a gunner only had to match the enemy's wingspan inside the illuminated ring. The sight did the prediction. In essence, the gun sight knew how far behind to aim. What had once required a mathematician's brain now fit inside a glass scope. This was the fusion of science and instinct, machines helping men do what nature hadn't equipped them for. As the technology matured, American bombers became flying fortresses in more than name. Their defensive network, 12 or more 50-caliber guns, each manned by a trained gunner and guided by computation, turned them into self-protecting fortresses of geometry and fire. Enemy fighters could no longer rely on the blind spots or panicked reactions of human opponents. Every burst they faced was increasingly precise, guided by math disguised as instinct. Yet even the best guns and sights were useless without strategy. The doctrine of aim behind was only one part of a far larger tactical transformation: mutual defense through formation flying. The U.S. Army Air Forces pioneered the concept of the combat box, a tight, layered formation where each bomber's gun arcs overlapped with those of its neighbors. In theory, no enemy could approach without flying through a wall of intersecting gunfire. But for that to work, every gunner had to be disciplined, to aim not emotionally, but predictively. If one man broke formation or fired too early, he could disrupt the synchronized pattern of defensive fire. Thus, aiming behind wasn't just about personal survival. It was about team precision. Each gunner was one gear in a vast mathematical machine moving through hostile skies. During the massive raids over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin, this doctrine was tested under the harshest conditions imaginable. Luftwaffe fighters swarmed from every direction, attacking from above, below, and behind. The sky became a three-dimensional chessboard where seconds defined fate. When the system worked, it was breathtaking. Dozens of German fighters would dive in, only to find themselves flying into perfectly calculated crossfire. In some cases, multiple gunners, each aiming behind from different angles, created converging bullet streams that intersected precisely where the enemy's flight path passed. The results were devastating: aircraft disintegrating midair, flames cascading downward, and the balance of power in the European sky slowly tilting toward the Americans. By 1944, the aim-behind doctrine had evolved from a strange classroom rule into the very rhythm of bomber warfare. The combination of discipline, machinery, and tactics had created something new, a networked defense system long before computers existed. But this was only half the picture. The other side of the story lay across the battlefield, in the cockpits of German fighters, where experienced Luftwaffe pilots began to realize that something about the Americans' aim had changed. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it every time they tried to break through a bomber formation, and found death waiting in what used to be safe sky. For German fighter pilots, the early days of the American bombing campaign were thrilling hunts. A tight bomber box might look intimidating, but it also appeared predictable, slow, heavy, and easy to flank. Luftwaffe aces, like Egon Mayer and Hermann Graf, developed attack patterns that exploited human reflexes. They banked in fast, fired short cannon bursts, and escaped before return fire could track them. In 1943, This tactic worked with terrifying success. But by mid-1944, something changed. The same approach that once guaranteed kills began ending in disaster. Pilots found themselves flying into bursts of gunfire that seemed to anticipate their every move. Some swore the Americans were using radar to track them. Others believed the bombers had developed automatic weapons systems. In truth, it was neither. It was simply men who had mastered the art of prediction. From the German cockpit, the illusion was maddening. A burst of tracer fire might appear to miss wide, streaking harmlessly behind the fighter. Then, in the blink of an eye, the aircraft would fly into the arc of bullets. It felt like invisible hands were closing the trap. Reports from Luftwaffe group commanders recorded the confusion. After the second Schweinfurt raid, one pilot described it bluntly. "Their fire seems delayed, but the delay kills you." German analysts eventually recognized what was happening. The Americans had learned to lead by deflection rather than instinct. But by then, it was too late. The attrition rate of veteran Luftwaffe pilots was catastrophic. Every loss meant fewer experienced men to teach the next wave how to fight differently. Meanwhile, the Americans were training thousands of new gunners each month in the same physics-driven doctrine. The numerical and tactical balance had flipped. Beyond tactics, the doctrine of aim behind was also a quiet victory of discipline over emotion. It taught soldiers to conquer the very instincts that made them human. In combat, adrenaline demands immediate reaction. Yet survival demanded patience. A half-second pause to let mathematics catch up with fear. That half-second often decided who lived. Psychologists studying returning gunners noticed a pattern. Those who performed best under fire were not the most aggressive, but the most composed. Their pulse barely changed when the intercom screamed, "Fighters inbound!" They had internalized a paradox. The calmer they remained, the deadlier they became. In interviews after the war, veterans often described the act of aiming as almost meditative. The chaos outside, tracers, explosions, the smell of gun oil, faded into background noise. One waist gunner from the 91st Bomb Group said, "It wasn't rage. It was geometry. You didn't hate the man you shot at. You just solved the problem before he did." That philosophy marked a profound shift in how America approached modern warfare. The romantic ideal of the lone sharpshooter gave way to the era of systemized combat, where data, not instinct, defined victory. The gunnery schools, with their slide rules and film analyzers, represented the first wave of what would later become the digital battlefield. There was another layer to this transformation: culture. The United States in the 1940s was rapidly becoming a nation of engineers and problem solvers. From radar to atomic research, the war was a crucible of innovation. Gunnery doctrine was a reflection of that larger mindset, that any human limitation could be overcome with study, design, and repetition. The idea that knowledge could defeat instinct became a uniquely American military philosophy. It wasn't enough to have courage. One had to have understanding. A machine gunner was no longer just a brave soldier. He was a technician of survival. This mindset spread beyond the cockpits. The Air Force's integrated engineers into operational planning, allowing tactical doctrines to evolve with scientific insight. Ballistics experts calculated bullet dispersion and air resistance. Mathematicians refined optimal firing angles. Even psychologists contributed, analyzing how fatigue, cold, and oxygen deprivation affected reflexes. Every lesson learned in the classroom found its way to the front. Training films emphasized not heroism, but precision. Manuals replaced slogans with charts. The battlefield had become a laboratory. While the doctrine of aiming behind was born in the age of .50 caliber Brownings, its legacy reached far beyond. The same principles of prediction, lead, and relative motion became the foundation of post-war targeting technology. In the 1950s, as jet speeds rendered manual gunnery nearly obsolete, Engineers developed radar-guided and computing gun sights using the same mathematical logic. The pilot or gunner no longer needed to calculate. The machine did it instantly, predicting where the target would be when the projectile arrived. Even the first air-to-air missiles of the Korean War and early Cold War borrowed directly from the lessons of WWII gunnery. Missiles weren't fired at where the enemy was, but programmed to intercept its future position. The same counterintuitive thinking, aim wrong to hit right, had become a permanent law of modern combat. In retrospect, the aim-behind philosophy represented something greater than a tactical adjustment. It was a psychological evolution, a bridge between instinctive war and analytical war, between emotion and computation. By the time the 8th Air Force began its final pushes into Germany in early 1945, the transformation was complete. The men inside those bombers no longer thought like riflemen. They thought like mathematicians with machine guns. Each burst of fire was a calculation of angles, velocities, and probabilities. And the Luftwaffe, bleeding and exhausted, could no longer outthink them. This shift, from instinct to science, from reaction to prediction, marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one that would define the skies for decades. But to truly grasp how this doctrine reached its peak, how it was tested under fire and proven in the blood-red skies of Europe, we must enter the turning point of the story, the moment when theory met chaos and mathematics met mortality. It was August 17, 1943. The morning sky over southern Germany was deceptively peaceful, pale blue, with streaks of silver contrails gliding eastward. But behind those contrails came thunder. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses from the 8th Air Force were streaking toward two of the Reich's most vital industrial targets, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. One produced the ball bearings that kept German machinery alive. The other, the Messerschmitt, Me-109 fighters that defended the homeland. It would become one of the most infamous raids of the war, and the ultimate test of America's new gunnery, doctrine. From the moment the bombers crossed the Dutch coast, the Luftwaffe was waiting. Radar stations near Bremen and Frankfurt began relaying signals. Hundreds of fighters scrambled to intercept. By the time the first formations reached central Germany, they were surrounded by a storm of fast-moving Me-109s and FW-190s. The air became a swirling inferno of black puffs and burning metal. Inside one formation, the men of the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, gripped their triggers. Each man had heard the same warning before deployment. You'll want to shoot straight at them. Don't. Trust the lead. As the German fighters dove in from the high sun, the American gunners opened up. To an outside observer, it looked chaotic. Tracers weaving through empty space, far from the oncoming fighters. But inside the formation, it was calculation. Every burst was aimed off, each line of fire laid deliberately behind the visible target. At 500 yards, the first Me-109 banked to attack. The waist gunner in the lead ship, Sergeant William Horan, tracked it with steady hands. The fighter's nose cannon flashed, streaking shells past the bomber's fuselage. Horan didn't flinch. He aimed just off the wingtip, a space that seemed absurdly empty, and fired a 2-second burst. The fighter flew directly into it. The bullets struck its engine, cowling, and cockpit in less than a blink. It flipped, disintegrating into a tumble of fire. Over the intercom, someone shouted, "Good hit! Left waist!" But no one celebrated. There wasn't time. More fighters were diving, using slashing attacks from multiple directions. For the next hour, the sky became a moving geometry problem. Each gunner calculated angles instinctively, firing where nothing yet existed, trusting that when the bullets arrived, the enemy would too. The gunfire patterns looked almost artistic, arcs of orange light drawn through blue air. And they worked. Dozens of German fighters broke off, damaged or destroyed. Still, the cost was staggering. Many bombers never made it home. Entire squadrons were shredded by cannon fire and flak bursts. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers that day. More than 600 men killed or missing. But what stood out in the combat analysis afterward wasn't just the losses. It was the hit probability. Despite overwhelming opposition, the American gunners had destroyed over 40 Luftwaffe fighters, and dozens more were crippled beyond repair. The statistical reports showed a shocking pattern. The majority of confirmed kills came from deflection bursts, shots fired off the mark, precisely in line with the new doctrine. For the first time, analysts could prove that aiming wrong was right. At Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, officers studied the results. They noticed that gunners trained under the full deflection program, including the M2I, 7.2 camera. Trainers and theoretical courses showed twice the effectiveness of older crews who still relied on instinctive aiming. This wasn't coincidence. It was data-driven survival. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid marked the inflection point. Though the losses horrified commanders, the gunnery results validated the doctrine completely. The after-action reports concluded with a single sentence that summarized years of scientific work. Those who fired ahead of the target's apparent position achieved the highest probability of destruction. In other words, those who trusted the math lived to fly again. Over the following months, new training films incorporated footage from that mission. The raids became case studies in every gunnery school across America. Instructors paused the reels to show students exact moments when tracers intersected the path of incoming fighters. They circled frames where bullets appeared to miss, yet seconds later, the enemy plane exploded. To young recruits, it was gospel. Never aim at what you see. Aim where the enemy will be. As winter set in and the Allied offensive pushed deeper into German skies, the doctrine evolved even further. Gun crews began coordinating their fire through radio discipline, timing, and practiced geometry. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was choreography. By late 1944, as the Luftwaffe's strength waned and American formations grew in size, the results became undeniable. Gunner efficiency doubled. German attacks that once tore through bomber lines now faltered, swallowed by invisible webs of intersecting trajectories. It was the climax of the invisible revolution that had begun in those training classrooms years earlier. A revolution not of weapons, but of understanding. But even that wasn't the final test. The most critical proof would come months later, in the bitter winter skies over the Ardennes, when America's mastery of predictive fire would help decide the fate of the last German offensive. December 1944, the Ardennes. The last German offensive of the war had begun. The Battle of the Bulge. Under a sky thick with snow and smoke, Hitler's armored divisions lunged west, hoping to split the Allied line and capture Antwerp. For the first time in months, the Luftwaffe surged back into the skies, desperate to support the ground push. Their target: American supply convoys, bridges, and airfields. But waiting for them above the frozen forests were men who had learned the art of impossible aim. When the clouds broke, the 8th and 9th Air Forces launched hundreds of B-26 Marauders, P-47 Thunderbolts, and B-17 Flying Fortresses to hammer the German advance. The Luftwaffe countered with Mi-262, C-2 jets, AFU-190s, and Mi-109s, faster and deadlier than ever. It was the perfect storm of speed, chaos, and lethality. Exactly the kind of battle where instinct failed and calculation triumphed. From the ground, Belgian villagers saw fiery streaks tracing the sky, orange ribbons looping, twisting, vanishing into the clouds. To the trained gunner, each line was an equation. In the cockpit of a B-26 named Ruthless Angel, Sergeant Daniel Corbett manned his tail guns as German fighters dove in through the snow glare. His breath fogged his oxygen mask. The bomber shook violently as cannon shells exploded nearby. Through the gun sight, he saw the oncoming blur of an FW-190, fast, climbing, then banking right. His instinct screamed to fire directly at it, but Corbett's training overrode panic. He swung the barrels slightly off, a lead of 4 aircraft lengths. The tracers curved through white mist, vanishing. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the FW-190 sliced through the path of fire and disintegrated. Another crewman later said, "It looked like the bullets waited for him." This pattern repeated across the front. Squadrons that had once struggled to defend themselves were now executing near-perfect deflection bursts. The gunnery data that had been proven over Schweinfurt was now saving lives across the Ardennes. Even more remarkable was what the intelligence reports showed afterward. Luftwaffe pilots, facing catastrophic attrition, began describing the American bombers in terms they once reserved for nightmare aircraft. "Their fire bends time," one captured pilot reportedly said. "You dodge it, but it finds you anyway." It wasn't superstition, it was timing. At these closing speeds, where 2 aircraft might be converging at over 700 miles per hour, a delay of even 0.2 seconds could mean the difference between a miss and a kill. American gunners, trained to fire late, to aim behind the visible target, had effectively learned to predict that delay. Every movement, every squeeze of the trigger was synchronized to the physics of closing speed. By January 1945, the results were being quantified. Across the 8th Air Force, hit probabilities had increased by more than 90% compared to the first year of operations. Crews were firing fewer rounds and bringing down more fighters than ever before. The mathematics of motion had turned into a doctrine of dominance. This transformation wasn't limited to bombers. The same principle guided fighter pilots like those flying the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang. Their gunnery training, refined through thousands of film simulations and camera analyses, taught them to anticipate their enemy's path, not react to it. When a German fighter banked hard to escape, the American didn't chase the plane. He led his guns through where it would appear. This predictive mindset gave the U.S. fighters a deadly edge in the dogfights over the Bulge. In a matter of weeks, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft, and, crucially, its last reservoir of trained aces. By the end of January, the Allies had regained full control of the skies. The German ground offensive faltered without air support. Tanks burned on snowfields that had once seemed impregnable. The Luftwaffe's final effort to reclaim dominance had been destroyed, not just by superior numbers, but by superior understanding. Historians later argued that this victory represented the true culmination of the American air doctrine, the complete marriage of science, technology, and training. Every gunner in every turret had become part of a predictive network, bound by invisible equations of lead and timing. What began as a strange rule shouted by instructors, "Aim behind him!" had evolved into a law of modern aerial warfare. In the final weeks of the war, when Allied bombers darkened the skies over Berlin, the Luftwaffe barely rose to meet them. Those who did found themselves flying into invisible grids of fire. The Americans no longer guessed. They calculated. And in war, precision is mercy only for one side. The doctrine that began in training halls and simulator rooms had rewritten the physics of survival. It had proven that a human being, when armed with understanding, could overcome even the limits of instinct. But every victory has its aftermath, and the cost of this transformation would linger long. After the guns fell silent, when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and the last Luftwaffe fighters were burning on the runways of shattered airfields, the numbers told a quiet story of evolution, not of glory, but of understanding. In the span of just 3 years, The U.S. Army Air Forces had transformed its gunners from instinctive shooters into mathematical marksmen. The ratio of rounds fired per enemy aircraft destroyed had dropped from nearly 12,000 in 1942 to fewer than 5,000 by 1945. In some elite bomber groups, particularly within the 303rd and 91st, it fell even further. A statistical revolution achieved not by building new guns, but by retraining human minds. Analysts at Wright Field compiled mountains of data after the war. They studied camera gunnery footage, after-action reports, and recovered wreckage from Germany's industrial heartland. What emerged was proof of something larger than tactics. It was proof that a scientific approach to instinct, the deliberate retraining of reflex, could multiply human effectiveness under pressure. The principle of deflection fire, once a counterintuitive curiosity, had become a psychological weapon. For veterans, the realization came slowly. Many only understood years later what they had really done up there, how their discipline had been part of something much bigger than themselves. In letters home and post-war interviews, gunners described the eerie calm that came with experience. "You stopped shooting at planes," one said. "You started shooting at physics. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity." They had learned to think like their weapons. The legacy of this training outlived the war itself. When the U.S. Air Force became an independent branch in 1947, its manuals and training programs preserved the same fundamental logic. The brain must predict motion, not react to it. That doctrine shaped everything, from early jet training to the way radar intercept officers calculated lead pursuit courses in Korea and beyond. And yet, the transformation had its human cost. The gunnery schools that produced such precision had also stripped men of their reliance on instinct, something that was hard to recover in peacetime. Veterans spoke of struggling to retrain themselves back into ordinary life. Driving cars, playing baseball, even throwing objects. Everything seemed too slow, too simple. The war had rewired their reflexes for the extreme. For others, it was the memory of the moment that haunted them. The split second of decision, when instinct screamed to fire now and training whispered wait. That whisper had saved their lives, but it had also created a permanent distance between their senses and their emotions. It taught them not to trust what they felt, only what they knew. Psychologists studying returning crews in 1946 noted this strange detachment. Many exhibited what they called mechanical calm, a serene, almost machine-like response to danger or stress. In normal life, it looked like numbness, but in war, it had been perfection. Still, for the men who survived, there was pride. Quiet, grounded pride. They knew they had been part of something that turned the tide of the air war. The same men who once missed every shot were now shooting down German fighters with uncanny precision. They had become proof that intellect could triumph over instinct, that fear could be disciplined into logic. When medals were awarded, few spoke of bravery anymore. They spoke instead of efficiency, teamwork, and precision. It was the dawn of a new kind of heroism, one measured not by emotion, but by mastery. The skies of Europe had proven that even in chaos, order could be taught, repeated, and multiplied. But as the war ended and the world stepped into the nuclear age, the question lingered. What would this new, mathematical understanding of combat mean for the future of warfare? When machines began thinking faster than men could aim? In the years following the war, the doctrine of predictive fire, the simple act of aiming behind the target, became one of the quiet cornerstones of modern warfare. It shaped not just aerial gunnery, but the very way military engineers thought about targeting, reaction, and control. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the skies once again filled with dueling aircraft. But now, both sides flew at jet speeds far beyond anything imagined during World War II. At closing velocities of nearly 1,000 miles per hour, human reaction alone was useless. The old visual instincts were now hopelessly outdated. Yet the principle remained the same: lead, anticipate, and predict. American pilots who had grown up under the wartime training system adapted quickly. The same aim-behind philosophy, translated through new computing sites and radar-assisted guns, gave the U.S. Air Force an edge in aerial duels over MiG Alley. What had once been a classroom theory had become a universal combat law, untold doctrine baked into the reflexes of an entire generation of aviators. By the 1960s, that principle evolved into something even more profound. The early Sidewinder missile, for instance, didn't chase the enemy's current location. It predicted its path based on infrared heat. The math was the same. The philosophy was unchanged. The weapon simply did what American gunners had learned to do by instinct 20 years earlier. Deflection had become automation. The human brain's struggle with time and motion had been translated into circuitry. And yet, buried within this technological progress was something almost tragic: the loss of the human art that had once defined survival. The gunners who'd stared through frost-covered glass at incoming fighters now watched as machines calculated what they once learned through repetition and discipline. They were proud, but they also understood that their craft was disappearing. In museums and training manuals, their methods became historical footnotes. But the underlying lesson, that intellect must rule over impulse, lived on in every piece of modern targeting software, every drone strike, every automated fire control system. When a modern pilot locks onto a moving target and the computer predicts the impact point, it's the ghost of those same World War II gunners doing the math. There was also a moral echo in this evolution. The same principle that made American gunners more lethal also made war more detached. The distance between man and target, once measured in yards of empty sky, became symbolic of the distance between action and emotion. The better soldiers became at prediction, the less war depended on feeling. Commanders after the war were acutely aware of this shift. Air Force instructors warned new recruits that precision should never replace judgment, that understanding the enemy's motion wasn't the same as understanding the cost of pulling the trigger. In the post-war lectures at Maxwell Air Force Base, veteran gunners were invited to speak to cadets. They described how science had saved their lives, but also how it had stripped away the illusions of glory. "You don't win," one said softly. "You just survive by knowing where he'll be a second from now." The simple instruction that once sounded absurd, "aim behind him," had become a metaphor for the modern age. To see beyond the present, to think faster than fear, and to trust knowledge over instinct. It was more than a gunnery principle. It was a world view. By the time jet bombers replaced propeller-driven aircraft and guided missiles replaced turret guns, the men who had first practiced that doctrine were old, retired, or gone. But the logic they'd learned in those frigid skies remained encoded in every new weapon system the world would build. When future generations of engineers programmed radar intercept algorithms or missile guidance computers, they were unknowingly writing the same invisible equation that once echoed through the intercoms of B-17s. Don't aim where he is. Aim where he will be. And just like that, the legacy of the American gunners, those who learned to aim wrong to shoot true, had become eternal. The war had ended, but their logic had taken flight into the future. High above Europe's battlefields, amid smoke and cold and fire, a strange truth was born: that in order to win, a man had to learn to stop trusting his own eyes. The lesson of the American gunners was not just about physics or weaponry. It was about the human mind's ability to adapt, to rewrite its instincts when survival demanded it. The command, "aim behind him," sounded like madness to anyone who had not seen combat, yet it became a symbol of clarity in a world consumed by chaos. It showed that courage isn't always charging forward. Sometimes, courage is the discipline to pause, to resist the reflex, to act on understanding rather than fear. In that half-second between sight and trigger, a man became both soldier and scientist. The skies of World War II were laboratories of mortality. Every pull of the trigger tested the limits of what the human brain could calculate under pressure. But they also revealed something hopeful, that intelligence, precision, and learning could overcome instinct, chaos, and terror. The men who aimed behind the target didn't just defend their bombers, they defended the idea that knowledge could be a shield. Their bullets traced equations through the air, invisible arcs of understanding drawn across the horizon. In the decades that followed, machines would take over their calculations, and the art of human deflection shooting would fade into history. Yet, its spirit endures. In every radar-guided system, every smart missile, every algorithm that predicts motion before it happens. The physics remained the same, only the hands changed. What began as a desperate lesson in survival became a universal law of combat, and perhaps of life itself, that the future belongs to those who can think just a little further ahead than instinct allows. The gunners of the 8th Air Force proved it in the crucible of the sky, men who learned that to hit the truth, you sometimes have to aim a little behind it.